create law. And I don't remember the numbers now, but I've gone through these statutes, and a number of them have 15, 20 cents of Congress provisions in one bill.
Thank you very much. I have many more questions, but we're going to pass the time, so turn it over to Ranking Member Babin for his.
NASA just released details highlighting its plans for the low Earth orbit commercialization. The intent of the plan is to facilitate private sector use of low Earth orbit to offset the government's costs in LEO so that NASA can focus on deep space exploration. And the focus of the plan appears to be focused on selling access to the ISS. And Mr. Gerstenmaier, will this offset NASA's costs for ISS transportation and operations? And if so, by how much? And if not, then why decrease NASA's utilization?
Yeah, so the intent is not to lower NASA's costs for this activity. The idea is to essentially allow the commercial sector to experiment with revenue-generating activities on board station. And for that, we want to recoup some of the costs associated with the activities of which they're using on station, and that was the pricing policy that we placed for them. It's not an absolute pricing policy, but it gives them an idea of how to build a plan. And the idea is then, can they then look at, from that, determine whether a private station on their own that they built could be used, and then that's something that NASA could then acquire services from in the future. Okay. So the purpose of that was to allow them to essentially experiment with revenue-generating options and concepts moving forward. And we didn't take things away. We made available to them 5% of the available time on ISS, and that 5% we can remove from our other activities and move forward. So we still protect our basic research. We still protect the fundamental research needed for exploration and human health and other aspects.
Okay. Will revenue derived from the ISS commercialization plan go back to the Treasury, or will it stay with NASA? And what oversight will Congress and the taxpayer have on funds derived from the taxpayer's significant investment in the ISS?
Again, our focus really isn't on capturing revenue. The intent is to allow them to experiment, and then later in the future, where they now have their space station to serve other purposes other than the government's purpose, then we're one user of many, then we're buying from a larger service, and that lowers our cost for future activities. But the intent is not to generate revenue.
I understand. And Mr. Martin, recent reports from your office have highlighted the need to develop new spacesuits, both for future use in the microgravity environment of LEO for extravehicular operations and for future deep space missions and surface operations. Our current extravehicular mobility units were designed in the late 70s. Astronauts have nearly drowned from water leaking into their helmets, and the current astronaut corps would very much benefit from a larger variety of suit sizes. Future spacesuits for surface operations were postponed years ago after a contract protest and deferments under the previous administration. How important is the ISS for NASA's testing of the next generation of spacesuits?
It's critical for testing the EMUs, and I think NASA has a plan to get the next, called the X-EMU suit, up on station by 2023.
Okay, great. Thank you. Good news. And then Mr. Stallmer, recent IG reports and a report from the Science and Technology Policy Institute were pessimistic about the potential of the private sector offsetting government's funding in LEO. Can you comment on the private sector's perspective of LEO commercialization? And is this something that the private sector could provide private capital for, or does the private sector see this as another opportunity for more government money?
Yes, I saw that report, and I somewhat disagree with the assessment, the pessimism of what markets are there. As we're talking about offsets, I don't think the station was designed as this economic engine, for in low Earth orbit. It started off as a scientific platform. But I do see the investment that the private sector community is making. For instance, the Space Angels Network, which is start off as a small group of small investors into space, making minimal, smaller investments, is now over 200 individual investors that are investing in these companies that are going to be doing work on the International Space Station. So I don't see a trend of companies coming up up to the Hill to ask for more and more money for the station. I think it's what we're looking for is stable policies that we know that we can work within the boundaries of the space station. So,
excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. And Dr. Gabrinowitz, NASA's plans allow for private astronauts on the ISS. Current law allows for government astronauts under the current statute. What is a private astronaut under the current statute, and what are the differences in these names from a practical perspective and also from a legal perspective?
Thank you. I'll get this right before the end of the hearing.
I'll be here for you.
Thank you. Well, as the designations indicate, a government astronaut is an employee of the federal government, and as such, there are legal rights and privileges that astronaut has and restrictions. It's roughly analogous to being a member of the military. You have certain rights and obligations that a civilian does not have. A private astronaut, it would not be a government employee. Their relationship would be based on for whom they work, or if they work for themselves, at whose direction are they taking instruction. Are they acting as an agent for an entity? And therefore, that person's rights and obligations are going to arise from that relationship. But then there's the additional overlay that if you have a private sector astronaut who is a non-governmental actor, then ultimately the United States is responsible for that astronaut anyway. There's that additional overlay. And I just want to give you a little background as to why that responsibility exists, because it's very important to the United States values. When the Outer Space Treaty was being negotiated, it was the position of the Soviet Union that only nation states were legitimate space actors. And of course, the United States couldn't agree to that and said, no, private entities are also legitimate state actors. Well, a compromise was made between the Soviet and the American position, and that compromise was that non-governmental space actors will be authorized and continually supervised by the nation that is party to the treaty. So that supervision, that authorization, is the source of the right of the private sector to be in space. And the flip side